4 months into the war, and fighting continues to rage on, particularly in the east of the country. The Pope says Russia's invasion of Ukraine was partly provoked by NATO. He denied that he's backing President Putin as he denounced the cruelty of Russian soldiers, but certainly his comments will certainly themselves provoke a reaction. So I'm going to speak to Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO policy under Presidents Obama and Biden. Welcome to the programme, Jim.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I wonder what you made of the Pope's comments.
Well, I don't know who's writing his talking points. I think that's it's just not the case that NATO was provoking this, that NATO had anything to do with Russia invading Ukraine the way it's been doing. I think this is something that is Russian propaganda, and I think it's somehow gotten into the bloodstream there in the Vatican, and it's too bad, but that's just not true.
What do you think is your assessment at the moment of the progress of the Ukrainian-Russian forces, respectively? So we hear a lot, and it's very difficult for people to make a judgment, I think, about who's winning and who's resisting who's holding out more strongly, whether or not the Russian forces can last, whether the Ukrainian resistance can hold. What's your assessment of the situation?
Well, it is difficult for people who are not kind of engaged in this on a day-to-day basis to try to figure all of that out. I think what you could say is that Ukraine has surprised everyone about how tenacious they have been in terms of fighting the Russians and in using the equipment that the UK, the US, and other allies and partners have pushed into Ukraine for their use. And I think we've been surprised at how the Russians have made so many mistakes early on, and the Ukrainians were able to capitalize on that. So at the very beginning of this war, I think most people thought things were going pretty well for Ukraine. But what's happened now is it's shifted to another part of Ukraine that really gives a lot of terrain and a lot of advantages to the Russians. And they are now employing a tactic that I think your listeners who study history will recognize from World War I, where the Russians are using artillery to pound away at cities and to just chip away at the Ukrainians and to make things look quite different than they did early on. So it's hard to tell right now, but I think it's inevitable. Unfortunately, this Russian war of attrition against Ukraine.
If it's inevitable, then surely there must come a moment when it's decided that the resistance can't work. So that's the difficult call, isn't it? If one moves from a situation of optimism and feels that Russia will not be able to succeed to one of pessimism and feels that they'll eventually grind down the Ukrainians, you then get this question, which is what is a good moment to reach an accord with Putin? But even to talk about that seems, certainly to me, it seems like those are almost difficult words to get out.
It is. It's very difficult to get out. And I think what you just laid out very well is the question now that everyone is having to face because we see this grinding away by the Russians. And for the Ukrainians to turn the table against Russia will require a lot more from the West than we're giving them now, a lot more in terms of long-range artillery, a lot more in terms of a constant flow of ammunition going into Ukraine. They're very brave, and they're very good fighters, and they're holding out. But Russia is bigger. Russia has more people. Russia has more weaponry that they can put onto Ukraine, and we have to take that into account as we're looking at the future. And that's just what your question gets at. And it's hard to talk about this because we want Ukraine to win. We have been providing Ukraine the tools to do that. But we've got to remember who we're dealing with. The Russia we're dealing with is not making the mistakes that we saw early on. This is a Russia being very brutal, using artillery to flatten anything in front of it. And either we have to pick up the pace in the West, the UK, US, others rushing in even more equipment, or we're going to have to face these questions that you just raised.
Do you think it'll be enough to provide simply equipment, or are we talking ultimately about having to make a choice between going in ourselves militarily or facing defeat?
Well, I don't think we're going to get to that particular point. I think if we can keep up the equipment, I think Ukraine can do the job. Give us the tools and we can do the job. I think Winston Churchill said something like that. And I think that's where we are. We've got to give them the long-range artillery. We've got to give them other things as well. They've got the people. But if their people are ground down because they don't have the equipment, then we'll be in a different place. And but I really don't see us putting boots on the ground. U.S., U.K., others. I don't see us doing that. But I don't want to be confronted by that question. I want to get equipment in there fast, the kinds of things that they need, so that we're not confronted with that kind of situation.
Tell us your own experience of dealing with the Russian administration of Putin, either him directly or indirectly with the regime, when you worked for Presidents Obama and Biden.
Well, I'll have to say I was very lucky in that I didn't have to deal with him because I dealt just with Europe and not with Russia, or Ukraine, or Eurasia. But I will say that I think all of us over the past number of years probably were too hopeful in what we thought he would eventually become. I think he certainly gave us plenty of warnings and speeches and things that he gave back. The invasion of Georgia certainly was a wake-up call in 2008. That he wasn't going to be a Russian leader that was going to try to make Russia into a European nation that we could work with. He obviously had other things in mind, and so what I will say is, while I haven't had to deal with him, I will say that there were a number of us, both on this side of the Atlantic as well as on the European side, that were a bit too hopeful and a bit and probably led by wishful thinking in a lot of ways. And didn't see and pay attention to that wake-up call in 2008. Now it's getting late.
Yeah, if we had paid attention to it, what difference would that have made? Would we have been able to do anything about it?
Well, I think what we would have done in 2008 would be, if we saw him for what he was, if we had managed to do that, I think we would have to strengthen NATO as much as we, the U.S., and U.K. too, as much as we were trying to strengthen NATO in those days. Most of the European nations were still in the thrall of the end of the Cold War and cutting back on defense spending, that type of thing. And so we didn't present to Putin both in terms of the alliance and in terms of assistance to Ukraine. We didn't present to Putin a tough obstacle. We made it too easy for him. If we saw what he had in mind, particularly after 2014 when he went into Crimea, we should have been pumping this type of equipment into Ukraine and increased the training that we were already doing. We should have done more, and we should have strengthened NATO, and we should have put everyone on notice that we were dealing with a different Russia now. But we didn't. We didn't do that. In 2014, we didn't do enough, and now we're dealing with the consequences.
Jim, Russia sort of makes a habit of announcing a sort of eccentric long lists of almost randomly chosen individuals against which it's imposing sanctions, and its latest one is against a number of British journalists. I noticed that my own boss, the editor of The Times, is John Witherow's on this list. It wasn't obvious why they chose one person rather than another. But I also wanted to know, if one is on that list of sanctioned individuals, how much of a nuisance is it, or is it just a piece of rhetoric?
I think it's a piece of rhetoric. I wish I was on that list. I'm trying, but you should tell your editor he's on a good list to be on. But yeah, I think it's just rhetorical. I'm not sure what the sanctions would inhibit you from doing. Maybe he won't be able to go to Moscow. But I think they're playing tit for tat. It's Russian propaganda. It's weak. And it just shows that we have to be strong countering that misinformation and that type of thing as well. It's not just on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's our fight, too, here dealing with this misinformation.
We've imposed ourselves all these sanctions, and some of those were far from rhetoric. They imposed very severe penalties on individuals. Were you of the view that will make any difference to Vladimir Putin? Will it have hindered him in any way? Or was it all just felt by individuals that rhetorically sounded like they had something to do with them, but have no more to do with the war effort than the editor of The Times does?
Well, I think the sanctions that we have put on, the West has put on, does hinder Putin. But it's really dealing with how much of this hindrance can you tolerate. I think what we have put on Putin for if you're a Western nation, if you're a Western leader, we're pretty serious in terms of your economy, in terms of so many aspects of your society. I think, but when you're dealing with the Russian economy, when you're dealing with the Russian society, when you're dealing with Putin, he's got a very high tolerance for this stuff. His objective is to have his way with Ukraine, and he feels he can last us out. I think his view is the West is going to be weak. The West is not going to be in it for the long haul, and as long as he can keep this war of attrition going in the Donbas area, and the pressure increases on the West to give us supplies, as well as to deal with the sanctions, as you were mentioning, that or the results of the sanctions that we've put on them, which is in the energy field. I think all of us, UK, US, nations in Europe, in many different ways, we're experiencing pain from the energy sectors, that we're not getting the Russian gas and oil that certainly Europe has needed. So I think at the end of the day, it's a pinprick, these sanctions on the journalist and on your boss. But I think what we're doing to Russia in terms of sanctions, I think it's a matter of tolerance, and I think it's a matter of something Putin thinks he's going to be able to withstand while he's buying time to watch the weakness in the West give him what he eventually wants, which is victory in Ukraine. And we have to be strong and not show him that weakness.
And we also have to show a kind of concentration and attention over a long period of time. Do you worry that your fellow Americans, for example, might lose concentration, might begin to get bored with the war in Ukraine?
Well, I worry about that with everyone, UK, US, across Europe. I think this is something where we don't want to just get used to this. We don't want to normalize this and move on with our daily lives while this is going on and not be seized with what's happening here. So yeah, I do worry about that. And it's really up to our leadership. I mean, the people have to remain united. The folks in Great Britain and here and other places. But our leadership, whether it's Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, it's Macron, others, they're the ones that are going to have to keep, reminding the peoples that the Ukraine fight is our fight too, and we can't afford to see Ukraine fall under the jackboot of the Russians, because then what will we have? It'll be worse. We will reap worse if we falter and we lose our focus. And we just look on this as someone else's problem. It's everyone's problem, and it's up to our leadership, to your prime minister and my president, to keep us strong. And I pray every day they can do that.
Jim Townsend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO Policy. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.